Have you ever wondered, why Israel? Why this narrow strip of land, smaller than New Jersey, dry and rocky, with fewer people than some major cities? Why does it feel like the entire world holds its breath every time Israel makes headlines? Why does every major religion stake some claim on Jerusalem? And why do end times prophecies, spiritual warfare, and global politics seem to revolve around this one ancient place? Is it just politics, or is there prophecy at play? Deep down, a lot of people wonder, but don't dare to ask, did God really choose them? Are the Jews still God's chosen people today? Is modern Israel a fulfillment of ancient scripture, or just a political twist of fate? And if God made promises to Israel thousands of years ago, how can they possibly still matter now? Maybe you've never looked deeply into it. Maybe you've always thought Israel was just a Bible detail, something ancient and dusty. But what if I told you that the story of Israel is still unfolding right now? What if everything from Genesis to Revelation and everything still to come is somehow connected to this one nation, this one people? By the time we're done, you'll see that Israel is not just land, not just history. It's God's prophetic timeline, a divine thread stretching from the call of Abraham all the way to the return of Christ. Let's go back to where it all began. He didn't have a church. He didn't have a Bible. He didn't have a pastor or a small group or a religious community to back him up. Abraham, still called Abram at the time, had one thing: a voice. Not a booming voice from a burning bush, not a dramatic dream or vision, just a voice that pierced through the silence of an idol-worshiping city, a voice that cut through a culture soaked in paganism. A voice that didn't ask him to improve his life, but to leave it. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Genesis 12:1. Imagine that. Leave everything. Leave the land you grew up on. Leave your inheritance, your security. Walk away from the only gods you've ever seen, stone idols and carved statues, to follow a God you've never met, to a land you've never seen, for a promise you can't even comprehend. This was the birthplace of a nation, not in a palace or a temple, but in the heart of one man who had nothing but faith. God told Abram, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12:2 and 3. This is where the covenant begins, a promise that would shape history forever, not because Abraham was perfect, not because he came from royalty, but because he listened, because he obeyed. He didn't see the promise, he stepped into it, one trembling step at a time. God didn't choose Abraham because he was the most qualified. He chose him to show something much deeper, that faith, not strength, not culture, not heritage, is what God uses to build nations. Abraham would become the father of a people set apart not just by bloodline, but by calling. Through them, Scripture would be written. Through them, the law would be given. Through them, the prophets would cry out. Through them, the Messiah would come. But let's not romanticize the journey. Abraham didn't glide across the desert with angelic music and sunshine. His story was messy. He faced famine. He was driven into Egypt. He feared kings. He had to rescue family. He nearly lost everything, more than once. And then came the promise of a son. But it didn't come for decades. And when Isaac, the child of promise, finally arrived, God asked him to do the unthinkable: lay him on an altar. That's the thing about obedience. It always costs something. Sometimes it costs everything. But for Abraham, obedience wasn't about what he saw. It was about who he heard. And that obedience unlocked a covenant that would stretch far beyond his own lifetime. Isaac became Jacob. Jacob became Israel. Israel birthed 12 tribes, and those tribes became a nation. But it all started here, with a voice and a man who dared to say yes. Now, you might still be wondering, why did God choose Israel? The answer is right there in Deuteronomy 7:7. The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest. He chose them not for strength, but to keep a promise to a man of faith. Abraham wasn't perfect, but he believed, and that belief was counted to him as righteousness. This covenant wasn't some handshake deal. It was sealed in blood. In Genesis 15, God tells Abraham to cut animals in half and lay them opposite each other, a common ancient practice for covenant making. But then something extraordinary happens. God himself, represented by a blazing torch, passes between the pieces. Abraham doesn't walk through. God is saying, I will keep this covenant even if you fail. Let my own blood be required if I don't fulfill my word. That's the weight of the promise, a divine vow, not dependent on Abraham's performance, not dependent on Israel's obedience. It was started by God, sustained by God, and would be fulfilled through God. But the promise didn't come wrapped in ease. God told Abraham straight up, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated. Even before the people of Israel were born, God saw Egypt. He saw the chains. He saw the oppression. And he also saw the deliverance. He saw Moses. He saw the Red Sea parting. He saw Mount Sinai trembling with fire. He saw blood smeared on doorposts and freedom marching through the waters. All of it set in motion by one man's obedience. Have you ever stopped to consider that your obedience today might unlock blessings for generations? Abraham never saw the whole picture, but he walked into it anyway. And to this day, we're living in the ripple of that decision. The Apostle Paul says it like this in Galatians 3:29, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. You see, this wasn't just a covenant for one nation, it was through that nation that the Savior of all nations would come. But let's bring it closer. When God asks you to step out of your comfort zone, your plans, your security, do you realize what's at stake? Obedience doesn't just change your life, it sets something in motion that heaven never forgets. Abraham's yes became Israel's foundation. His footprints through unknown territory became sacred ground. His surrender became the gate to a divine story that stretches from Genesis to Revelation. So the next time someone asks, why Israel? Remember this. Israel isn't just a people. They are a promise, a living reminder that when God speaks, he keeps his word. What he begins, he finishes. And sometimes, all it takes to change the world is one man listening to one voice. They were children of a promise, but they lived like orphans. For 400 years, the people of Israel cried out in the mud pits of Egypt. Their backs bent under the weight of bricks. Their identity was chained to slavery. These weren't random tribes wandering without a past. They were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They carried a divine covenant in their blood, and yet they woke each day as slaves, not saints. So we ask again, why? Why would the God who promised Abraham descendants as countless as the stars allow his chosen people to be broken, beaten, and buried in silence for centuries? Because promises aren't forged in comfort, they're proven in fire. Israel wasn't just waiting in Egypt, they were being forged into something deeper. They weren't being ignored, they were being formed. Before they could carry God's law, they had to be emptied of Egypt. Before they could inherit a promised land, they had to learn to despise bondage. Before they could become a nation, they had to be set apart. That's the paradox of pain. Oppression does something peace never can. It awakens the soul. It shakes loose the illusions. It exposes the idols. And in Egypt, every illusion of self-reliance was ripped away. They had nothing but each other, and a God who, though silent, never stopped watching. The book of Exodus opens with a shift. A new king rose up over Egypt, one who didn't know Joseph, didn't care about Israel's past, and feared their future. So he tightened his grip. Forced labor, ruthless oppression, infanticide. Pharaoh tried to erase Israel's strength by killing its sons. But the more he pressed them, the more they multiplied. Isn't that still true? The people of God often grow strongest in the shadows. And then God moved. Exodus 2:24 says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. That word remembered doesn't mean he forgot. It means he was ready to act. And his answer? A baby in a basket, floating down the Nile, spared from genocide, raised in Pharaoh's house, but marked by something deeper. His name was Moses. Moses tried early on to act in his own strength. He killed a man, then ran, hid in the desert for 40 years, buried his calling, until one day in the wilderness of Midian, a bush burned without being consumed, and the voice returned. I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I have come down to deliver them. Exodus 3:7. That's always the pattern. Bondage, deliverance, covenant. First, God reveals the slavery, whether it's to sin, fear, or idols. Then he delivers us, not through our efforts, but through his power. And then he invites us into covenant, not just to free us, but to form us. Moses returned to Egypt, trembling, unsure, but not alone. With a staff in his hand and fire in his bones, he stood before Pharaoh and said what no one had dared to say, "Let my people go." Pharaoh laughed, but God didn't. Each plague that followed wasn't random. They were precision strikes against the false gods of Egypt. The Nile turned to blood, judging the river god. Darkness fell, judging Ra, the sun god. And finally, the death of every firstborn son, a direct blow to Pharaoh's claim to divinity. But for Israel, there was a way out. A lamb, one for every household. Blood on the doorposts, and when the angel of judgment passed through Egypt, it passed over those covered by the blood. Not because they were righteous, but because they were covered. It was more than just freedom. It was a picture of substitution, a glimpse of something greater, a foreshadowing of a future lamb whose blood would once again make death pass over. They left Egypt in haste, battered, barefoot, bewildered, but finally free. The Red Sea split like a wound in the earth. They walked through, not as slaves, but as sons. And the same sea that freed them swallowed their enemies whole. Pharaoh's chariots sank into silence, and Israel, for the first time in generations, sang. But freedom wasn't the destination. It was the beginning. God didn't bring them out just to wander. He brought them to a mountain, Sinai. And there, amidst thunder, lightning, and smoke, he spoke. You have seen what I did to Egypt. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Exodus 19:4-5. This wasn't religion. It was a relationship.
God wasn't just rescuing them from something, He was calling them to something. At Sinai, they received more than commandments. They received identity. No longer were they scattered tribes. Now they were a nation under God. The Ten Commandments weren't just rules. They were the heartbeat of a holy people. And when the covenant was sealed with blood, it wasn't just ritual. It was marriage, a divine union between God and His people. But here's the tragedy. Freedom doesn't always produce faith. Though they had seen the sea part, though they had heard God's voice, though they had eaten manna and drank from a rock, they still doubted. Because slavery isn't just external, it's internal. Egypt was still inside them. Before they could enter the promised land, that entire generation would have to die in the desert. Have you ever left a toxic situation but still carried it in your soul? That's Israel's story, and it's ours too. Deliverance is instant, but formation takes time. The wilderness became their classroom. There they learned that being chosen doesn't mean ease, it means covenant. That freedom isn't about self, it's about surrender. That God isn't just a rescuer, He is a father. From slavery to sonship, from oppression to presence, from Egypt to Sinai, Israel's journey mirrors our own. But even with a covenant sealed and commandments given, Israel still longed for something visible, something human, something they could point to. They had no king, only God, until they demanded one. We want to be like the nations, they said. The very thing that made them different, their uniqueness, their divine calling, they wanted to trade for something common. God gave them what they asked for. Enter Saul, tall, handsome, impressive, but hollow. He looked apart, but his heart bowed more to people than to God. His reign was marked by insecurity, fear, and disobedience. But even in that failure, God had a plan. In the hills of Bethlehem, in forgotten fields, God whispered to a prophet. And there, hidden behind taller brothers, overlooked by everyone but heaven, stood a boy named David. When the oil flowed down David's head, the ground didn't shake, but history did. Because David wasn't just a king, he was a symbol. He danced before the ark, he sang psalms, he penned prophecies, he defeated giants. And through his bloodline, the Messiah would one day come. Under David, Israel united. Enemies fell, borders expanded, and most importantly, the ark, the presence of God, was brought to Jerusalem, not just into a tent, into the heart of the nation. Zion became the city of God. David longed to build the temple, but God said no. You've shed too much blood. Your son will build me a house. So David did everything he could to prepare. He gathered materials, drew up blueprints, prayed, worshiped, and then he passed the mantle. Solomon took the throne, and in his early years he was everything Israel hoped for: wise, just, golden. And then came the temple. Not just a building, but a dwelling. Every measurement, every stone, every detail divinely inspired. The inner sanctuary, layered with gold, carved with cherubim, hidden behind a veil. And when it was finished, the glory came. Not symbolically, literally. A cloud so thick the priests couldn't stand. God's presence filled the house. For the first time since Sinai, the glory didn't rest in the clouds or a tent, but in a city. Heaven touched earth, and Israel stood in awe. But oh, how quickly glory fades when the heart drifts.
Solomon had wisdom, but he didn't guard his heart. What started with gold ended in idolatry. His foreign alliances brought foreign gods. He built altars, not for Yahweh, but for compromise. Not because he stopped believing, but because he started accommodating. And just like that, the flame dimmed. The cloud didn't disappear all at once. It drifted, faded, stepped back. And isn't that still the danger? We want the fire of God, but only if it fits inside our plans. We say we want the presence, but we don't want the surrender. We want the glory, but not the cost. Solomon finished his reign in spiritual fog, and when he died, the fragile unity of Israel cracked. His son Rehoboam took the throne, but he didn't inherit the heart. When the elders asked for lighter burdens, he mocked them. "My father disciplined with whips. I will discipline with scorpions." That one sentence shattered the kingdom. 10 tribes rebelled. Led by Jeroboam, they became the northern kingdom, Israel. 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remained in the south, loyal to David's line. They became Judah. The once united kingdom now bled division. And then idolatry crept in like poison. Fearing a return to Jerusalem would sway hearts, Jeroboam built 2 golden calves, one in Bethel, one in Dan. "Here are your gods, O Israel," he said, echoing the sin of Sinai. It was Egypt all over again. False worship masked as convenience, national pride replacing spiritual truth. And from that moment on, the north spiraled. Not one righteous king, not one. From Jeroboam to Ahab, from idol to idol. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha cried out, warning, pleading, but their voices were drowned by Baal worship and burning children on altars. Until God said, enough. In 722 BC, the Assyrians swept through the north like a storm. Samaria fell, the cities burned, and the people, chained, scattered, absorbed, vanished into history. These became the 10 lost tribes. Gone. Gone were their banners. Gone were their homes. Some say they fled south. Some say they intermarried. Others say remnants survive in isolated places. But the Bible goes silent. Not because God forgot them, but because they forgot Him. Judah held on, barely. They still had the temple, still had the priests, still had the promise of David. And under kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, they saw glimpses of revival. But it didn't last. They quoted the prophets, but ignored their warnings. They worshiped in the temple, but sacrificed on the high places. They honored God with their lips, but not their lives. So God acted again. This time, it was Babylon. In 586 BC, Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. The ark was lost. The king was captured. The people were taken in chains. Why? Because God doesn't ignore spiritual adultery. Because holy ground cannot survive divided hearts. Because covenant love is fierce, and real love confronts. But even in exile, God wasn't done. Daniel saw visions. Ezekiel saw wheels of fire and dry bones rising. Jeremiah wept and yet spoke of a new covenant, a heart of flesh instead of stone. The prophets didn't just declare judgment, they declared return. And after 70 years, they came back. Not with trumpets, but with tears. Not as warriors, but as survivors. A pagan king, Cyrus of Persia, issued a decree, let them return and rebuild. And so, the exiles returned to ruins. The city was ashes, the temple was gone, but the altar, it was raised again. Zerubbabel led, Ezra taught, Nehemiah rebuilt the walls, and little by little, stone by stone, they came back, not just to a land, but to a calling. It wasn't perfect. The second temple didn't match Solomon's. The elders wept when they saw the foundation, but they built anyway. They stood for hours as Ezra read the law. They wept as the scrolls were opened. They repented, recommitted, remembered. And then, heaven went silent. No prophet, no angel, no fire from the sky. 400 years. It was quiet. But God wasn't gone.
He was preparing, aligning, setting the stage. The Greeks brought a common language. The Romans built roads that connected the world. Synagogues popped up in every city. The Torah was preserved. And then, in the womb of a teenage girl in Nazareth, the silence broke. The Word became flesh. Jesus didn't come with armies. He came in humility, not in a palace but a manger, not with a sword but with healing in his hands. He was everything the prophets foretold and nothing they expected. They wanted a warrior. He brought a cross. They wanted revolution. He brought repentance. And so many missed him. The ones who studied the scrolls, the ones who memorized the law, the ones who fasted for Messiah, they didn't recognize him. But he came anyway. He healed, he taught, he wept, he overturned tables, he forgave, he fulfilled every prophecy. And they nailed him to a cross. He wasn't overpowered, he surrendered. For them, for us. The veil tore, the price was paid, and 3 days later, he rose. And still, Israel rejected him. But not all. The early church was Jewish. Peter, James, John, Paul, all Israelites. The gospel started in Jerusalem. But as rejection grew, the message spread to Samaria, to Rome, to the ends of the earth. And then, in 70 AD, judgment came again. The Romans surrounded Jerusalem. Titus led the siege. The temple was burned, the city crushed, blood in the streets, and just as Jesus had said, not one stone was left on another. And once again, the people were scattered. Diaspora. 2,000 years. They became wanderers, exiles, strangers in foreign lands. But they survived. Through pogroms, inquisitions, ghettos, gas chambers, they endured. Why? Because God said they would. Jeremiah 31:36, only if the sun stops shining will Israel cease being a nation before me. No other people group in history has lost their land, their language, their temple, and survived. But Israel did. Because scattered does not mean forgotten. And in 1948, against all odds, Israel was reborn. A nation that hadn't existed for 2,000 years came back in a day. Hebrew was resurrected. Survivors of the Holocaust became citizens. Prophecy became history. Isaiah 66:8, can a nation be born in a day? Yes, and it was. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of the end. Israel is the fig tree that blossomed. The stage is set. Every global tremor, every conflict in Jerusalem, every peace summit, it's not just politics, it's prophecy unfolding. Jesus said he'd return, not to New York, not to London, but to Jerusalem. And in the tribulation to come, when the church is gone, Israel will once again become center stage. A remnant will awaken. The veil will lift. Zechariah said, they will look on me, the one they pierced, and mourn. Paul echoed it. All Israel will be saved. But before that will come pain. The world will turn. Nations will gather against her. It will look like the end. And then the sky will split. A white horse, a king returning. His feet will touch the Mount of Olives. And Israel, bloodied, broken, but believing, will finally cry, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The story that started with a man under the stars will end in a city crowned with glory. The temple will rise, the king will reign, the lion will lie with the lamb, the curse will lift, and Israel, God's covenant people, will shine again. Not because they earned it, but because God keeps his promises. So the next time you see Jerusalem in the news, don't just scroll, discern. Because every headline is a tick of God's prophetic clock. The king is coming, the story isn't over, and the best is yet to come.